If you've ever read a Regency novel or watched a period drama, you've seen it. A young woman at a ball receives a piece of news, and suddenly she wilts into the arms of the nearest gentleman. Historians have long debated why women of this era collapsed so reliably. The answer is not simply that they were dramatic. It's a dark convergence of hidden physiology and social programming. Their ribs were literally being displaced by tightly laced stays, compressing their lungs. Their faces were painted with lead and arsenic to achieve a fashionable pallor, slowly poisoning their nervous systems. And their diet, engineered to maintain a delicate frame, left them chronically anemic. The charming fainting couch has a backstory far more disturbing than you imagine. Tonight, we are peeling back the layers of silk and lace to uncover the unsettling medical reality behind the swoon. You know the iconic image: a pale young woman in a ball gown collapses dramatically into a gentleman's arms, a servant rushing forward with smelling salts. It's a trope so embedded in period dramas that we've almost stopped questioning it. But the real story isn't romantic. It's a toxic cocktail of fashion, vanity, and outright poison. In the early 1800s, the ideal woman was willowy, translucent, and perpetually on the verge of collapse. This wasn't just a literary fantasy. It was a dangerous physical standard that women harmed themselves to achieve. Their very undergarments were instruments of compression, remolding their rib cages and starving their brains of oxygen. But the corset was just the beginning. To achieve that coveted porcelain complexion, they painted their faces with lead and arsenic, heavy metals that slowly shut down their nervous systems. And to maintain a waspish waist and pale cheeks, they embraced a diet so deficient in iron that chronic dizziness and fatigue were inevitable. From the infamous tight lacing of the corset to the arsenic-laced powders they dusted on their cheeks, we will follow the evidence into the boudoirs and medical texts of the Regency era. So why did these ladies faint? Was it an involuntary surrender to their tortured anatomy, or a calculated social maneuver in a world that equated frailty with virtue? The answer is both, and far darker than any novel suggests. We're about to dissect the 4 shocking reasons behind the swoon, exposing the hidden history that your history books never told you. Get ready to enter a world where beauty was measured in breathlessness, and the ultimate fashion accessory was a fainting couch. Imagine it is the autumn of 1812. You are 18 years old, a debutante about to enter a crowded ballroom in Mayfair. Your gown is a diaphanous column of white muslin, deliberately dampened so it clings to your form in the unforgiving candlelight. But before you can dance, before you can breathe, you must first endure the ritual of the laces. Your lady's maid plants a knee in the small of your back, grips the crossed cords of your stays, and pulls. The wooden busk flattens your stomach. Your rib cage creaks in protest. The maid pulls again, cinching your waist down to a circumference your modern mind would find more appropriate for a child. The air rushes out of you, and you feel your heart begin to labor against the prison of whalebone. You are now ready to be presented to society, provided you can remain conscious. This was the physical reality behind the ethereal, floating figures we see in paintings by Thomas Lawrence. The Regency silhouette demanded a high-waisted empire line, which might sound comfortable until you understand that the support garment required to achieve it was still a heavily boned set of stays. While Victorian corsets later aimed for an extreme hourglass, the early 19th century version compressed the bust upward and flattened the diaphragm, redistributing internal organs into a completely unnatural arrangement. Modern reproductions and period medical texts are chillingly clear on the consequences. A woman's stomach and liver were pushed downward into her lower abdomen. Her intestines were compressed against her spine. Her floating ribs were gradually bent inward by years of constant pressure, sometimes so severely that they overlapped. And at the top, her lungs had nowhere to expand. But here is the thing. This was not a hidden danger whispered about in secret. Doctors of the era documented the damage openly. A physician in 1847 studied a sample of tightly laced women and found that their respiration rate skyrocketed under even moderate exertion. When they ran a short distance without stays, their pulse reached 156, and they breathed 32 times a minute. After they laced up, the same women hit a pulse of 176 and gasped nearly 50 times a minute, simply because the body was fighting for oxygen. The corset was quite literally suffocating them, not in a dramatic instant, but in a slow creep of lightheadedness, palpitations, and a permanent state of air hunger. Now, a casual observer might ask why any reasonable person would agree to this. The answer lies in the brutal social engineering of the era. A woman's body was not her own, it was a canvas upon which her family's ambitions were painted. A tiny waist signaled status. It meant you did not need to perform physical labor, that you could afford the elaborate lacing ritual, that you were ornamental rather than functional. The ideal woman was described with words like willowy, sylph-like, and fragile. Mothers and governesses reinforced this from the nursery. If you fainted, it was not a medical emergency. It was proof that you were exquisitely sensitive, a delicate flower too fine for this coarse world. This equation of frailty with virtue created a perverse incentive. Fainting became a learned social behavior, and the craziest part is that it was actually taught in finishing schools. You heard that correctly. The art of the controlled swoon was part of a young lady's education. She was trained to recognize the precise moment to collapse, how to soften her knees so she did not injure herself, and which direction to fall for maximum dramatic effect without exposing an ankle. A well-timed swoon could extract you from an unwanted proposal, silence a boorish conversationalist, or signal to a desired suitor that you needed his protection. The fainting couch became a piece of furniture not because women were constantly unconscious, but because the performance of unconsciousness was a routine social maneuver. Yet, this is where the story takes a darker turn. If you assume that all swooning was merely theatrical, you would be overlooking the grim medical evidence that many of these women were genuinely collapsing under the weight of their own toxic bodies. Because the corset was only the most visible restraint. The true horror was invisible, painted seamlessly onto their faces. While they struggled for breath inside their whalebone cages, they were also poisoning themselves daily with heavy metals in the name of beauty. The fashionable pallor we admire in old portraits was achieved with a base of white lead, and the flushed cheeks were a dusting of vermilion, which is just a polite word for mercury sulfide. The doctors' casebooks of the period are filled with symptoms that modern toxicologists would immediately recognize: chronic vertigo, seizures, neuralgia, and what they termed fainting fits. A wealthy woman in a beautifully appointed drawing room was often living in a miasma of her own making, absorbing arsenic from her cosmetics and lead from her creams. Combine that with a diet deliberately restricted to maintain a thin frame, one that was often dangerously low in iron, and you have a recipe for actual, non-theatrical collapse. The swooning heroine was often a profoundly unwell patient, and nobody was treating the cause. They were simply passing the smelling salts. So, how did this entire deadly system hold together for decades? Who profited from the fainting lady, and when did the cracks begin to show? We have unraveled the cage of whalebone, but the corset was the least of their worries. In the morning, every single lady of fashion sat down at her dressing table, picked up a brush, and began methodically painting poison directly onto her skin. The full inventory of that dressing table, and the agonizing neurological damage it wrought, is where we are heading next. Picture her morning ritual. The sun has barely crept over the London rooftops, but the lady of the house is already seated before a silver mirror, wrapped in a silk dressing gown. Her maid stands behind her, holding a small porcelain pot. The lid is lifted, and inside is a creamy white paste, shimmering like crushed pearls. To our modern eyes, it looks like foundation, but its true name is ceruse, and its primary ingredient is white lead. The lady closes her eyes and tilts her chin up as the maid begins to smooth the compound across her forehead. her cheeks, her throat, down to the edge of her collarbone. This is the daily mask, the uniform of the leisure class. And every morning, without exception, she is painting herself with heavy metal poisoning. Lead carbonate, the base of fashionable white face paint for centuries, had not lost its appeal in the Regency. In fact, by the early 1800s, the pursuit of a perfectly pale complexion had only intensified. A translucent, almost luminous skin was a badge of purity and privilege. Sunday-darkened skin meant laboring in the fields. The aristocracy dwelt indoors, shrouded behind curtains, their faces untouched by the vulgar sun. But since even the most sheltered lady might develop an occasional flush or freckle, the cosmetic industry supplied an arsenal of artificial pallor. The most popular product, known colloquially as whitewash, concealed imperfections with a mixture of lead, vinegar, and sometimes arsenic. The effect was exactly what society demanded, a smooth porcelain finish that made the wearer look like a breathing marble statue. The cost, however, was extracted silently from within. Here is what happens when lead enters the body daily through the skin. It accumulates in the bones and soft tissues. It disrupts the production of red blood cells, causing extreme fatigue and the very pallor that women were trying to achieve in the first place. It attacks the nervous system, producing tremors, memory loss, and seizures. By the time a Regency lady reached her mid-20s, she might have spent a decade absorbing lead through her pores, and, if she licked her lips, directly into her digestive tract. The chronic dizziness and fainting fits that were dismissed as feminine sensibility were, in many documented cases, textbook symptoms of lead poisoning. The beauty ritual was a medical emergency moving in slow motion. But the lead was only the beginning. To add a delicate pink flush to those lead-whitened cheeks, women used rouge. The most vibrant and expensive red pigment of the era was vermilion, which is mercury sulfide. They dabbed it onto their cheekbones and lips, inhaling particles of a potent neurotoxin with every application. Mercury poisoning, even in small cumulative doses, causes a constellation of horrors: uncontrollable shaking, mood swings, chronic inflammation of the gums, and a peculiar form of psychological deterioration known as erethism, marked by extreme shyness, irritability, and sudden fits of weeping or hysterical laughter. A woman who collapsed at a ball might be suffering not from the vapors, but from her own rouge. Yet these visible cosmetics were not the only source of toxic exposure. The most famous shade of the period was a brilliant emerald green, a color that decorated ball gowns, silk ribbons, and above all, wallpaper. This green was created using a compound called copper arsenite, known commercially as Scheele's green. By the Regency, it had become the must-have hue for the drawing rooms of the wealthy. Entire walls were covered in paper saturated with arsenic. In the damp English climate, when the wallpaper was warmed by a fire or absorbed moisture from the air, it released a fine toxic dust into the room. Children playing on the floor inhaled it. Women, confined to the house for hours, breathed a steady, low-level arsenic mist. The consequences were so widespread that an astonishing 80% of British wallpaper by the end of the 1800s would later be found to contain arsenic. Doctors of the time began recording strange phenomena. A woman in London suffered from fainting fits almost daily for years, losing weight, growing weaker, until she was removed from her newly decorated bedroom. Within weeks, her symptoms vanished. The room was tested, and the green wallpaper was found to be the culprit. But for decades, no one connected the dizzy spells and sudden collapses to the very walls that surrounded them. The sicker a woman became, the more she retreated to her bedroom, where the arsenic concentration was highest. The decor literally poisoned her in a closed loop. And then there were the eyes. If you look at a portrait from this period, you will notice that the women have large, limpid, impossibly dark pupils. This, too, was chemically induced. The juice of the belladonna plant, which means beautiful lady in Italian, was dripped directly into the eyes. Belladonna contains atropine, which paralyzes the muscles that constrict the pupil. The result was a dreamy, dilated gaze that was considered irresistibly alluring. But atropine is also a powerful poison. It causes blurred vision, dry mouth, hallucinations, and profound dizziness. A woman staggering across a ballroom might simply be reeling from the after effects of her own eye drops. Imagine now the total toxic load. Lead on the face, mercury on the cheeks, arsenic in the air, and belladonna in the eyes. Her body is fighting a forefront war against poisons, and its primary cry for help is to lose consciousness. The fainting couch was not a romantic prop, it was a triage station. Now, you might wonder, if this was true, why did no one simply stop? The answer lies in the terrifying social machinery that enforced these standards. A woman's marriageability, her family's economic survival, and her entire identity as a lady depended on her ability to embody this ideal of fragile beauty. The cult of fragility was absolute. A healthy, robust girl who could walk 5 miles and eat a full meal was considered coarse, unfeminine, and unattractive. Mothers actively policed their daughters' bodies, encouraging them to eat delicately, which meant just short of nothing. The phrase green sickness or chlorosis was used to describe the wan, pale complexion of adolescent girls, and rather than being diagnosed as anemia, it was romanticized as a natural stage of feminine development. To maintain the silhouette required by the high-waisted gown, young women were subjected to diets that were nutritionally catastrophic. The aim was a tiny waist, a flat stomach, and an ethereal lightness. Breakfast might be a cup of weak tea and a piece of dry toast. Lunch was a thin soup and perhaps a sliver of seed cake. Dinner was a small portion of white meat and a few spoonfuls of vegetables, often boiled until they surrendered all nutritional value. Red meat was avoided as too stimulating and too masculine. Iron-rich foods like liver or dark greens were virtually absent from the table. The result was a widespread chronic iron deficiency, the very definition of chlorosis. The symptoms are unmistakable: profound fatigue, breathlessness on the slightest exertion, a rapid and weak pulse, and a tendency to faint. When a young lady swooned at her presentation to the Queen, the attending physician would not reach for an iron tonic, because the connection between diet and blood health was still poorly understood. He would instead offer smelling salts and prescribe rest, which meant more time indoors, away from the sun, which further suppressed her body's production of vitamin D. The treatment for the disease was an intensification of its cause. It was a system so perfectly closed that it manufactured exactly the fragile, dependent, and perpetually unwell woman that society claimed to be protecting. But I need you to hear this next part clearly, because it shatters any remaining illusion that these women were only victims of their own vanity. The art of fainting was taught in finishing schools. It was part of the curriculum. Girls from the age of 12 were coached in the mechanics of the swoon, how to detect the precise moment of lightheadedness, how to soften the knees, how to fold gracefully rather than crumple, and how to fall backward in a manner that preserved modesty while maximizing dramatic appeal. The controlled feint was a social tool, a permissible escape hatch from the rigid rules of conduct. If a gentleman cornered a lady with a boorish political monologue, she could feint. If an unwanted suitor was pressing his case too ardently, she could feint. If she simply needed a moment of quiet attention in a roaring ballroom, she could feint, and within seconds, a flock of matrons and servants would surround her with vinaigrettes, fans, and tender inquiries. The performance was so normalized that some women carried tiny bottles of ammonia in their reticules, not to revive themselves, but to provide the authentic stage business of revival. The fainting couch, that low-slung, chaise-like piece of furniture with one arm raised, became a staple of the drawing room, not because women were unconscious all day, but because the possibility of strategic collapse had to be accommodated at all times. This blurring of the line between genuine physiological collapse and theatrical performance created a society-wide confusion. Doctors could not always distinguish the victim of lead poisoning from the expert performer of feminine distress. Husbands and fathers, who held total legal authority over the women in their households, often dismissed genuine symptoms as female theatrics, a hysteria that required only a stern word or a dose of calomel. The medical establishment of the time was complicit in this ambiguity. Its leading minds proposed that women fainted because their smaller brains and weaker nervous systems were overwhelmed by emotion. The diagnostic category of hysteria absorbed everything from seizures to fainting to simple unhappiness. The cure was often a regimen of isolation, bloodletting, and the very corset that had caused the problem in the first place. But not everyone was silent. Across the sea, in France and in the radical corners of English society, a few physicians dared to ask a revolutionary question. What if the corset was not a support but a vice? In the 1790s, the philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft had already called fashion a badge of degradation, but her critique landed on mostly deaf ears. By the 1820s, a small number of surgeons began publishing papers documenting the skeletal deformities of deceased tight-lacers. They described ribs that had been permanently warped into crescent moons, livers deeply grooved by the pressure of whalebone, and lungs that had never fully inflated. These papers, dry and clinical though they were, contained within them a grenade of evidence against the fashionable world. Yet they were largely ignored, buried under the weight of custom, commerce, and the powerful economic interests of the corset makers. And that is where the story takes an even sharper turn. Because while a few doctors were murmuring their warnings, the corset industry was booming. The growing middle class, eager to emulate the aristocracy, created a massive new market for stays. Corsetiers became wealthy and influential. Fashion plates in ladies' magazines, which were now circulating in the tens of thousands, promoted ever more restrictive silhouettes. The fainting lady was not a cautionary figure. She was an advertisement. The very fact that a woman swooned proved that her waist was small enough, her dedication absolute, and her femininity unassailable. So the toxic system not only held together, it hardened. It colonized the finances, the education, and the self-image of women across the social spectrum. But every empire of control eventually meets its resistance. And the first truly organized rebellion against the corset and all it represented would emerge from a group of women who were sick of being sick. They would argue that a woman's body was not a fashion accessory, and their first symbolic act was to change the shape of their own undergarments. That movement, and the backlash it provoked, was set to ignite in the middle of the 19th century, but an even more shocking catalyst had already occurred behind closed doors. A single death so gruesome that it could not be forever suppressed. That death, its terrifying autopsy report, and the revolution it ultimately triggered, is where we are going after this brief pause. Her name was Eleonora, and she was 17 years old. The date was May the 12th, 1864, and the occasion was her debut ball at a grand house in Bath. She had been laced that evening by a maid who was under strict orders to reduce her waist to 17 inches, a circumference her mother considered the absolute maximum for a girl of good breeding. Eleonora had pleaded that she felt unwell, that her vision was blurring and her ribs ached, but her mother had simply handed her a vinaigrette of ammonia and told her that discomfort was the price of beauty. By 11 o'clock, Eleonora had danced 3 waltzes and taken a single glass of weak punch. At 11:22, she collapsed in the center of the floor. A doctor was summoned from among the guests. By 11:40, Eleonora was dead. The autopsy, conducted 2 days later at the insistence of an unusually honest coroner, revealed a catalogue of horrors that the polite world had long refused to acknowledge. Her ribs had been gradually reshaped by years of tight lacing. The lower 3 on her left side were found to have crossed one another, like the fingers of a clasped hand. Her lungs were pale and collapsed, chronically underinflated, their lower lobes perpetually compressed. Her liver bore a deep, permanent groove carved by the relentless pressure of whalebone. Her stomach was displaced downward into her pelvis. The immediate cause of death was recorded as a pericardial effusion, fluid compressing the heart until it stopped, brought on by the combination of oxygen starvation, toxic lead load, and extreme physical constriction. Eleonora had been, in the coroner's grim phrase, slowly crushed from within. When the coroner's report was published in a medical journal, it ignited a firestorm, not among the general public, who had little access to such esoteric literature, but among a small circle of reformist doctors, clergymen, and what were then called strong-minded women. The corset, they argued, was not a garment of support, but an instrument of torture. Eleonora's ribs, donated to a teaching hospital and kept in a glass case, became a silent exhibit in the growing case against fashionable dress. But the backlash was immediate and ferocious. Corset makers who controlled a lucrative industry worth millions in today's money, and the magazines that depended on their advertising, mounted a coordinated defense. They claimed Eleonora was an anomaly, a girl with a weak constitution, a hysteric who had laced too tightly against professional advice. The fashion press urged women not to panic, and the ballrooms of London remained as tightly laced as ever. The death of one girl did not dismantle a system, but it did plant a seed, and that seed found fertile ground in the most unexpected of places, the radical parliament of women's undergarments. In 1851, a woman named Amelia Bloomer had already dared to propose a costume consisting of a loose tunic over wide Turkish trousers, a garment so outrageous that it was greeted with public ridicule and physical violence against its wearers. The Bloomer costume, as it was christened, was not a success. Many who tried it were pelted with stones and rotten fruit. But by the 1870s and 80s, a new generation of activists had learned the lesson. They understood that to attack the corset was to attack the entire edifice of patriarchal authority, and so they must build an alternative, not just preach reform. This alternative took physical shape in the form of the Rational Dress Society, founded in London in 1881. Its members, who included aristocrats, artists, and physicians of both sexes, argued that clothing should be comfortable, hygienic, and above all, should not deform the body. They designed dresses that hung from the shoulders without a waist seam, supported by lightly boned vests instead of rigid corsets. They published pamphlets with titles like The Evils of Tight Lacing and Dress and Health. They held public exhibitions where wax models displayed the internal organs of a corset wearer compared to a healthy woman, and the visual contrast was so shocking that many attendees reportedly fainted at the sight. The irony was not lost on the reformers, but the greatest weapon in the rational dress movement's arsenal was not a pamphlet or a wax model. It was a machine with 2 wheels and a diamond frame. By the 1890s, the safety bicycle had arrived, and with it a transformation of female mobility so profound that it is difficult to overstate. A woman on a bicycle could not wear a corset. She could not manage a bustle, a train, or a heavy wool skirt. She needed freedom of movement, and the bicycle demanded it. The image of the new woman, astride her bicycle in a divided skirt, or even rationals, pedaling through the countryside with her hair blowing free, became the iconic symbol of the changing era. The fainting lady, confined to her drawing room, was suddenly obsolete. The new woman was too busy breathing to swoon. Yet the very air she breathed was still, in many cases, poisoned. And this is where the story takes an even more disturbing turn, because the dress reformers, for all their courage, could not immediately solve the problem of the home itself. While they fought the corset, the walls, the carpets, the curtains, and the very dresses they wore were still saturated with arsenic. In 1861, the chemist Arthur Hill Hassell had proved beyond doubt that arsenical greens were killing people. But the British government, ever solicitous of industrial profits, dragged its feet on regulation. Manufacturers insisted their pigments were safe, and the public, in love with the brilliant green, kept buying. It was not until 1893 that a young doctor named William Hines published a comprehensive study linking arsenical wallpaper to an epidemic of chronic illness among women and children, and even then, the industry fought back, claiming that eating wallpaper was not the same as living near it. The sarcasm of the reformers grew sharp. "Do not lick the walls, madam, and you shall be perfectly safe." Meanwhile, in the chemist's shop, a quieter revolution was unfolding. The decades of the 1880s and 90s saw a concerted push by a handful of ethical entrepreneurs to produce cosmetics free of lead and mercury. They experimented with zinc oxide and starch as a base for face powder, with beetroot and carmine as rouge. The new formulations were not always perfectly safe, but they marked the beginning of the end for the deadly ceruse that had poisoned generations. The educated public, now more aware of germ theory and hygiene, slowly began to associate the heavy white mask of the old aristocracy not with beauty, but with disease. A clear, healthy complexion, achieved through fresh air and exercise, became the new aspirational ideal. But the most profound change was political. The women's suffrage movement, gathering force in the final decades of the century, explicitly linked physical liberation to the vote. The corset was denounced on platforms and in newspapers not merely as a health hazard, but as a literal shackle, a device that kept women passive, breathless, and dependent. The militant suffragettes, who would later chain themselves to railings and smash windows, trained their bodies for endurance and strength, rejecting frailty as a weapon of the oppressor. Emmeline Pankhurst herself spoke of the need for women to have strong bodies to match strong minds. The fainting lady, in this new rhetorical landscape, was no longer a romantic heroine. She was a collaborator in her own imprisonment. This ideological shift was matched by a technological breakthrough that, more than any pamphlet or protest, would spell the end of the corset. In the late 1880s, a French woman named Herminie Cadolle, tired of the whalebone prison, cut a corset in two at the waist and suspended the upper part from straps that went over the shoulders. She called her invention the corselet gorge, and it is widely considered the first modern brassiere. The garment supported the breasts without compressing the ribcage. It allowed a woman to breathe, to bend, to move. By the time Mary Phelps Jacob patented her own version of the backless brassiere in New York in 1914, the revolution was already won. The corset, as a universal female undergarment, was dead. It would linger in attenuated forms, as the girdle, as the bullet bra, as a fetishistic costume piece, but its reign of terror over women's internal organs was finished. And with the death of the corset came the death of the swoon. Not instantly, not universally, but with a swiftness that, in historical terms, was breathtaking. Between 1890 and 1910, the incidence of fainting among upper-class women plummeted. The reading rooms and ballrooms no longer needed fainting couches. The smelling salts were put away. Young women took up tennis, golf, and mountaineering. The concept of frailty as a feminine virtue was comprehensively discredited. A woman who fainted at a public event in 1910 would be seen not as exquisitely sensitive, but as a medical emergency or a hopeless anachronism. How did this happen so completely, so quickly? And what became of the generation of women who had grown up in the old system, their bodies already damaged by decades of corsets and poison? The answer involves a forgotten medical scandal, a radical reimagining of the female body, and a single invention that did more to liberate women's breathing than any piece of legislation ever could. That final chapter, from the discrediting of frailty to the world we inherited, begins now. The forgotten medical scandal that finally broke the corset's stranglehold on Western fashion did not erupt in a parliament or a newspaper. It erupted in a lecture hall, in front of an audience of physicians who had spent decades politely ignoring what was right in front of them. The year was 1881, and the venue was the International Medical Congress in London. A young Scottish surgeon named William Playfair, already known for his pioneering work in obstetrics, rose to deliver a paper on the effects of tight lacing. He had brought with him something no one in the audience had ever seen before: plaster casts. Actual three-dimensional molds taken from the torsos of women who had worn tightly laced corsets for years. He placed them on the podium, and the room fell deathly silent. The casts revealed what autopsy reports had only hinted at: ribs that curved inward like the bars of a crushed birdcage, deep, horizontal indentations across the liver, where the edge of the corset had permanently notched the organ, a sharply angled sternum pushed so far inward that the heart had been displaced sideways. Playfair did not speak in the language of moral reform or feminine rights. He spoke in the cold vocabulary of pathology, presenting the corset not as a garment, but as a medical device constantly exerting up to 80 pounds of pressure per square inch on the soft tissues of the abdomen. He called it a slow thoracic catastrophe. And then he made the claim that truly scandalized the assembly. He stated that tight lacing was not an extreme practice limited to a few vain women. It was, he argued, endemic across all classes of British society, encouraged by mothers, enforced by fashion plates, and tacitly approved by a medical profession too timid or too compromised to speak out. The reaction was instant and polarized. Some doctors applauded, others walked out. The corset industry, which had its tendrils deep in the advertising revenue of medical journals, responded with a fury that was breathtaking. Within weeks, anonymous pamphlets were circulated accusing Playfair of sensationalism, of exaggerating his data, of undermining the moral fabric of society. A corset manufacturer in Manchester publicly offered a reward to any woman who could prove that her corset had injured her, a cynical challenge that few were in a position to accept. But the plaster casts could not be uncast. They were photographed, reproduced in textbooks, and circulated among the growing network of rational dress societies. The image of the crushed torso became the abolitionist poster of the anti-corset movement. Then, in 1887, an even more devastating piece of evidence emerged from the laboratories of a young German scientist named Wilhelm Röntgen. You will know his name because he invented the X-ray. And in the early years of the 20th century, as X-ray machines became available in major hospitals, doctors could for the first time see the living interior of a corseted woman without cutting her open. What they saw was appalling. The X-rays showed the lower ribs overlapping like Venetian blinds, the stomach squashed down into the pelvic bowl, the intestines crowded into a tiny compacted mass, the diaphragm so elevated that it barely moved. The images were published in the popular press, and the public, for the first time, could see the evidence with their own eyes. No medical degree was required to understand that the silhouette of fashion was a structural deformation. The fainting lady was not a fragile flower. She was a woman whose body had been mechanically compromised. Now, you might assume that shocking X-rays and medical congresses were the final nail in the coffin of the corset. But history is not so tidy. The corset did not simply die, it metamorphosized. A new generation of entrepreneurs, sensing the shifting wind, began to market what they called health corsets. These were garments that claimed to provide support without compression, made from elastic fabrics, reinforced with flexible steels, and designed according to the new principles of anatomy. The most famous of these was the straight front corset, introduced around 1900, which pushed the bust forward and the hips back, creating the S-bend silhouette. It was marketed as healthy, scientific, and liberating. In reality, the S-bend corset tilted the pelvis so severely that it caused an epidemic of lower back pain, displaced uteri, and a new generation of fainters who had traded crushed ribs for wrecked spines. The fad lasted barely a decade before the same medical forces that had killed the Victorian corset killed this one too. But while the fashion world was chasing the next silhouette, a truly revolutionary garment was quietly entering the nurseries of Britain. It was called the Liberty Bodice, and it may have saved more girls from a lifetime of breathlessness than any doctor or reformer ever could. Patented in 1908 by Fred Cox, a director of the Symington Corset Company, the Liberty Bodice was a soft, fleecy knitted vest reinforced with cotton tapes but entirely free of whalebone, steel, or rigid busks. It buttoned up the front, allowed a child to dress herself, and permitted the full, unrestricted expansion of the ribcage. It was marketed to mothers with a slogan that was both gentle and devastating: the emancipation of the little body. The impact was generational. A girl who grew up in a Liberty bodice never learned to accept compression as normal. By the time she reached adolescence, she found the adult corset intolerable. The generation born after 1900 was the first in centuries to develop lungs that had never been chronically restricted. They grew taller, breathed deeper, and rarely fainted. The Liberty bodice sold in the millions across Britain and the Commonwealth, and it remained in production with minor modifications until the 1960s. It was not a political statement. It was not a feminist manifesto. It was a comfortable undershirt, and it changed the shape of the future. Simultaneously, the physical culture movement was redefining what a female body should look like. Women like Eugene Sandow's female protégée began to display musculature that would have been considered grotesque a generation earlier. The Gibson girl, drawn by Charles Dana Gibson, became the archetype of the new century: tall, athletic, with broad shoulders and a waist that was trim but achieved through muscle and posture, not whalebone. She played golf, she rode a bicycle, she swam. When she entered a ballroom, she did not float in a haze of lead powder and shallow breaths. She strode. The consequences of this transformation were felt in the most intimate spaces. The fainting couch, that low, curving piece of furniture designed to receive the collapsing lady, disappeared from furniture catalogues with startling speed. In 1895, every respectable drawing room required one. By 1915, they were being sold as novelties or refashioned into chaises longues for sunrooms. The smelling salts bottle, once a staple of every lady's reticule, became a theatrical prop. Apothecaries still stocked it, but the primary customers were now hikers and athletes who used ammonia inhalants to ward off fatigue, not to revive themselves from swoons. The very word vapors slid from medical terminology into archaism, a joke at the expense of grandmothers. And what of the women who had survived the old regime? The generation born in the 1840s and 50s, who had been laced from childhood and painted with lead, entered their old age with bodies marked by decades of internal warfare. Medical journals of the Edwardian period contain careful follow-up studies of women who had been severe tight-lacers. They suffered prolapsed stomachs that required surgical suspension, chronic intercostal neuralgia, spinal curvatures that made walking difficult, and a catalog of digestive disorders that condemned them to a diet of mush and milk. The lead that had accumulated in their bones slowly leached back into their bloodstreams in old age, causing a wave of late-onset neurological symptoms that puzzled doctors who had forgotten the Cyrus era. They were the last casualties of a war that had already ended, living monuments to a beauty standard that had destroyed them. But there is one final grimly ironic detail that must be told, because it reveals the endless ingenuity of the human capacity to poison itself in the pursuit of beauty. Just as the lead and arsenic cosmetics were being purged from the market, in the 1890s, a new miracle substance was discovered in Paris. It glowed with a ghostly luminosity that was utterly enchanting. It was radium, and by 1900 it was being added to face creams, lipsticks, and powders, marketed as a rejuvenating treatment that brought color to the cheeks and vitality to the skin. The women who had escaped the lead mask walked straight into the radium glow. They painted their lips with it, dusted their faces with it, and, in some documented cases, drank radium-infused waters as a tonic. The fainting fits that their mothers had suffered from lead and mercury gave way to a new epidemic of jaw necrosis, anemia, and radiation sickness. The cosmetic poison had simply changed its isotope, so the Regency swoon was not a single phenomenon, but a layered catastrophe. It was, at its root, a collision between a physical cage of whalebone and a chemical assault of heavy metals, wrapped in a social script that demanded women perform weakness. The moment that collision ceased, when the cage was loosened and the script rewritten, the fainting stopped. Not because human biology changed, but because the cultural and mechanical conditions that manufactured the swoon were dismantled piece by piece. The corset, the lead, the finishing school training, the arsenic wallpaper, the iron-deficient diet, each had to be identified, fought, and overcome in a sequence of battles that spanned a century. And here, perhaps, is the most surprising detail of all. Historians who have examined the medical records, the diaries, and the hospital admission logs of the late 19th century have found something remarkable. Even at the height of the corset era, the majority of working-class women, those who labored in factories and fields, did not faint with any regularity. It was a luxury of the leisure class. The swoon was a class marker, a bodily performance that required the time, the garments, and the toxic products that only money could buy. The mill girl with her unboned stays and her sun-darkened skin was far healthier than the viscountess with her 17-inch waist and her lead-painted face. The fainting lady was, in a very real sense, a victim of her own privilege. And when that privilege finally killed enough of them, the survivors finally decided that breathing was more important than beauty. The story of the swoon is the story of a society that had to learn, at terrible cost, that the air in a woman's lungs is not a fashion accessory. It is tempting, looking back, to feel superior. We read about lead face paint and think, how could they not know? We see an X-ray of crushed ribs and think, how could they tolerate this? But the truth is far less comfortable. The Regency lady was not stupid. She was not uniquely vain. She was a rational actor inside a system that rewarded self-destruction with social survival. Every mother who laced her daughter into a 17-inch corset believed she was giving the child her best chance at a good marriage, a secure home, a life free from the grinding poverty that awaited the unmarriageable. The cosmetics industry that sold arsenic and mercury was not run by cackling villains. It was run by businessmen who marketed their products with exactly the same promises we hear today: youth, radiance, desirability, the erasure of imperfection. The women who bought those products were doing what women have always been taught to do: maintain themselves, improve themselves, discipline their bodies into shapes that the world will reward. The poison was just a detail. And here is the question that this history leaves hanging in the air, a question that should unsettle anyone who believes we have left such follies behind. What are we breathing in right now? What toxins are we absorbing through our skin in the name of beauty? What constrictions are we accepting as normal? What performances of frailty or strength are we enacting because the culture demands them? The corset did not vanish from human life. It changed its name. It became the shapewear bodysuit, the waist trainer, the compression garment marketed to postpartum women with the whispered promise that their bodies are broken and must be fixed. The lead face paint did not disappear. It became the injectable filler, the laser resurfacing, the chemical peel that burns away the top layer of skin, the unregulated serum ordered online from a country with no safety standards. We have our own arsenical wallpapers. They are the microplastics in our water, the endocrine disruptors in our fragrances, the forever chemicals in our non-stick pans. We are still living in a world that prioritizes profit over safety, that asks individuals to navigate a minefield of hidden hazards with no map and no guide. And the fainting? The swoon as a social performance? That, too, endures. It has simply been updated for a new era. The modern woman does not faint. That would be too passive, too Victorian. She burns out. She runs on cortisol and caffeine until her body forces a collapse, and that collapse is medicalized, medicated, and treated as an individual failure, rather than a systemic one. The cult of fragility has been replaced by the cult of relentless productivity, but the underlying mechanism is the same: A female body contorted to meet an impossible standard, absorbing damage, performing wellness, until something finally breaks. And yet, the story of the Regency swoon is not only a cautionary tale, it is also a story of liberation. It shows us that these systems, however entrenched, however profitable, however endorsed by doctors and magazines and mothers, are not permanent. They can be dismantled. The corset fell. The lead mask was abandoned. The fainting couch was relegated to the attic, and then the antique shop. It took a century of activism, medical whistleblowing, technological innovation, and the quiet refusal of millions of individual women to keep lacing themselves into unconsciousness. But it happened. The air in a woman's lungs ceased to be a fashion accessory. She was permitted, finally, to breathe. So, as you settle into your own evening, perhaps in a soft sweater with an elastic waistband, perhaps with a cup of something warm and a face free of heavy metals, spare a thought for the women who came before. They paid for the air you breathe with their ribs, their nervous systems, and too often their lives. They were not weak. They were enduring an ordeal that their society had normalized to the point of invisibility. And the next time you see a heroine swoon in a period drama, you will know what the cameras do not show. The grooves in her liver, the lead in her bones, the years of slow suffocation that made that graceful collapse, not a gesture of feminine sensitivity, but a body finally, mercifully, giving up the fight. If you have enjoyed this journey into the darker corners of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it ensures you will not miss the next deep dive. I would also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from, what time it is for you, and if there is a historical mystery or a hidden truth you have always wondered about. I read every comment, and your curiosity often shapes the next exploration. Until then, dim the lights, burrow into your blankets, and remember, history is never quite what we were taught. It is stranger, darker, and infinitely more human. Sleep well.